In the quiet suburbs of modern America, a small yellow sign stands in a front yard. It bears a simple message: property protected by security system. The house behind it has no cameras, no alarms, no monitoring service. Yet night after night, would-be intruders pass it by, choosing easier targets down the street. What these criminals don't realize is that they're falling victim to a psychological warfare tactic perfected over 80 years ago on the battlefields of Europe and North Africa. This is the story of one of the most ingenious yet largely forgotten security innovations of the Second World War. A method so effective that it saved countless lives without firing a single shot. A technique so powerful that it continues to protect homes and businesses today, often without people even realizing they're using it. This is the story of the dummy minefield and the art of deterrence through deception, the birth of psychological warfare. The year was 1940. Europe had descended into chaos. The mechanized armies of the Third Reich had swept across Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying speed. Traditional defensive positions crumbled before the coordinated assaults of tanks, aircraft, and infantry. Military strategists on both sides faced a sobering reality. In modern warfare, static defenses could be overwhelmed by determined attackers with sufficient resources. But war, as the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote thousands of years earlier, is fundamentally about deception. The side that can make the enemy believe a lie gains an advantage worth more than 1,000 soldiers. And it was this principle that would give birth to one of the most elegant defensive innovations of the entire conflict. The German military, despite their aggressive doctrine, understood this principle intimately. Their Sicherungstruppen, or security troops, were often tasked with holding vast stretches of territory with minimal manpower. These units couldn't possibly defend every kilometer of their assigned sectors with conventional means. They needed force multipliers, methods to make a small garrison appear far more formidable than it actually was. Enter the concept of the Scheinminenfeld, the dummy minefield, the anatomy of deception. To understand the brilliance of this tactic, we must first understand the terror that real minefields inspired. Land mines had been used in various forms since the American Civil War, but the Second World War saw their deployment on an unprecedented scale. Millions of these hidden devices were planted across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. They were indiscriminate, patient, and absolutely terrifying. A soldier advancing across open ground had no way to know if the next step would be his last. Mine detection was slow, dangerous work. Even with specialized equipment, clearing a minefield required meticulous care and exposed engineers to enemy fire. For every mine cleared, there might be 10 more waiting just beyond. The psychological impact was immense. Entire units would halt their advance, their momentum completely shattered by the mere suspicion of mines ahead. The Germans, masters of tactical innovation born from necessity, realized something profound. If the fear of mines could stop an army, then the appearance of mines might do the same job at a fraction of the cost. Creating a convincing dummy minefield was an art form. It couldn't be too obvious, yet it had to be noticeable enough to achieve its purpose. The Germans developed detailed procedures for this deception. First, the ground would be disturbed at regular intervals, mimicking the pattern of actual mine placement. Soldiers would use shovels to create slight depressions in the earth, just as if mines had been buried and the soil replaced. But disturbed earth alone wasn't enough. Experienced reconnaissance troops might spot the difference between freshly dug soil and genuine mine placement. So the Germans added another layer to their deception. Scrap metal pieces, often from damaged vehicles or spent ammunition casings, would be buried in shallow holes. These metallic fragments would trigger the primitive mine detectors of the era, causing them to beep and buzz just as they would over real explosives. Tripwires, easily visible to the trained eye, would be strung across the suspected minefield's perimeter. These wires, typically used to trigger real mines, served dual purposes in dummy fields. They marked boundaries that enemy troops would naturally avoid, and for soldiers who did spot them, the visible wires suggested that more dangerous hidden triggers lay beyond. The placement of dummy minefields followed specific tactical logic. They were positioned where advancing forces would naturally channel their movement. Obvious paths between natural obstacles, approaches to bridges, open fields that offered clear fields of fire to defensive positions. The Germans wanted enemy commanders to see these minefields and think, of course they would mine that approach. It's exactly where I would place them. The power of the sign. But the true genius of this system lay not in the dummy mines themselves, but in the signs that marked them. Military forces have always used markers to identify hazardous areas for their own troops. During the Second World War, this practice became standardized and, paradoxically, weaponized. The German military developed an elaborate system of minefield marking. Official regulations required that all minefields, real or dummy, be marked to prevent friendly casualties. These signs were painted in bold red and white, mounted on stakes that could be seen from a distance. The word Minen or Achtung Minen warned of danger ahead. Here's where the psychological warfare became truly sophisticated. The Germans used different marking systems for real and dummy minefields, but this distinction was known only to their combat engineers. For real minefields, the lettering on warning signs would be vertical. For dummy fields, the lettering would be slightly slanted. To an Allied soldier or reconnaissance unit, both types of signs looked equally official, equally threatening. The slight difference in angle was imperceptible unless you knew exactly what to look for. This created a perfect dilemma for advancing Allied forces. Every warning sign demanded attention and caution. Even if intelligence suggested a field might be fake, the cost of being wrong was catastrophic. Engineers would be called forward. Mine detectors would sweep back and forth, their operators tense with fear at every electronic squeal. Probe teams would advance on their stomachs, carefully prodding the earth with bayonets, searching for the telltale resistance of a mine casing. Hours would pass, sometimes entire days. All while the defending force, perhaps just a few dozen men with light weapons, watched from prepared positions. The dummy minefield had bought them time, disrupted enemy planning, and forced the expenditure of valuable resources, all without a single explosive device actually being present. Variations on a theme. As the war progressed and both sides learned from each other, the art of the dummy minefield grew more sophisticated. The British, facing the threat of German invasion in 1940 and 41, deployed fake minefields along their coastlines. These were often more elaborate than the German versions, complete with fabricated mine detection reports and carefully controlled information, leaks designed to reach German intelligence. In North Africa, where the vast desert spaces made traditional fortifications impractical, both Axis and Allied forces used dummy minefields extensively. The legendary German commander Erwin Rommel became known for his creative use of deception. His forces would create the appearance of massive mined zones using minimal resources, channeling British advances into carefully prepared killing zones. The Japanese fighting in the Pacific used variations of this tactic, adapted to jungle warfare. Rather than open fields, they would mark trail junctions and beach approaches with signs warning of mines or booby traps. The dense vegetation made verification nearly impossible without physically entering the danger zone. American and Australian forces learned to treat every warning sign, every suspicious disturbance in the undergrowth, as a potential threat. One particularly clever variation involved the strategic placement of obvious dummy mines. A few clearly visible metal discs, half buried in sand or mud, would be positioned at the edge of an area. These fake mines were meant to be discovered quickly by enemy scouts. The thinking was brilliant, If you found 5 or 6 obvious dummy mines, you might conclude the entire field was fake and advance confidently, only to discover too late that real mines had been planted deeper in, or that the visible dummies were actually covering tripwires connected to genuine explosives. Soviet forces defending their homeland against the German invasion took the concept to its logical extreme. With millions of citizens mobilized for war effort, they had the manpower to create truly massive, deceptive mine belts. Entire collective farms would be employed to disturb vast tracts of land, creating the appearance of minefields stretching for kilometers. German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph these suspicious areas, and intelligence officers would dutifully mark them as probable mine zones on tactical maps. The cost to create these deceptions? Relatively minimal. Some paint for signs, a few hours of labor to disturb the ground, perhaps some scrap metal. The cost to the enemy, immeasurable. Days of delay, exhausted engineer units, shattered momentum, and the constant psychological weight of wondering which fields were real and which were elaborate bluffs. The psychology of deterrence. To understand why this tactic was so effective and why it continues to work in modern contexts, we need to delve into the psychology of risk assessment. Every human being, whether a soldier approaching a potential minefield or a burglar eyeing a house, performs rapid cost-benefit analysis when facing uncertain danger. Psychologists call this threat appraisal. When confronted with a potential hazard, our brains quickly evaluate several factors. How likely is the threat to be real? What is the potential cost if the threat is genuine? What benefit do we gain by accepting the risk? Is there an alternative path that offers similar benefits with less risk? For a soldier in World War II, the calculations were stark. Advancing through a marked minefield, even a suspected dummy, meant accepting the possibility of sudden destruction. The benefit, continuing the advance, had to be weighed against the potential cost of taking that step. Even if intelligence suggested a particular field might be fake, the uncertainty remained. Could you really stake your life on might? This uncertainty is the key to effective deterrence. It doesn't matter if the threat is real or imagined. If the target of deterrence cannot determine the truth with certainty, they must plan for the worst-case scenario. A dummy minefield marked with official-looking signs creates what game theorists call an information asymmetry. The defender knows the truth, the attacker does not. This imbalance favors the defender enormously. Military planners during World War II quickly grasped an important principle. A dummy minefield, properly executed, was often as effective as a real one. The key word is properly executed. A half-hearted attempt at deception, easily spotted as fake, might actually encourage enemy aggression. But a well-crafted dummy, supported by official markings, disturbed ground, and perhaps a few genuine obstacles mixed in, could stop an advance as effectively as thousands of real mines. The Germans documented numerous instances where Allied forces spent days probing and clearing dummy fields, allowing defending units to reorganize, bring up reinforcements, or simply withdraw to better positions. In some cases, entire offensive operations were delayed or rerouted because of the threat of mines that never actually existed. This phenomenon had a name in military circles: force multiplication. A small defending unit, through clever use of deception, could tie down enemy forces many times their size. One German security regiment, tasked with holding a 20-kilometer front with barely 800 men, created the appearance of a heavily fortified and mined position. Allied intelligence estimated they faced at least 3,000 defenders backed by extensive mine belts. The actual advance didn't begin until overwhelming force could be concentrated, by which time the German unit had long since withdrawn. The dark side of deception. But this tactical innovation came with serious complications and moral ambiguities that military forces still grapple with today. The use of dummy minefields, while effective, created a dangerous precedent that had consequences far beyond the battlefield. One immediate problem was fratricide, harm to one's own forces. Despite the different marking systems, confusion was inevitable in the chaos of combat. Units would be transferred between sectors without proper briefing on local mine layouts. Retreating forces pressed by enemy advances might fall back through areas their own side had marked as mined, uncertain if the fields were real or fake. Soldiers, told to avoid certain areas because of mines, might find themselves trapped between enemy fire and what they believed was a lethal obstacle. The Germans, who used this tactic most extensively, documented numerous instances of their own personnel being injured or delayed by their dummy minefields. Ironically, the psychological effect that made these deceptions so effective against the enemy also affected friendly forces who weren't fully informed about their true nature. An even more serious problem emerged in the war's aftermath. The line between dummy and real minefields became hopelessly blurred. Liberated territories across Europe contained countless minefields, but records of their exact locations and composition were often lost in the chaos of retreat. Were those warning signs marking real mines or elaborate fakes? The only way to know for certain was to send someone to check, a task that cost thousands of lives in the years following the war's end. Some historians estimate that more people were harmed by mines and unexploded ordnance in the decade after World War II ended than during the conflict itself. Farmers returning to their fields, children playing in former battle zones, reconstruction workers clearing rubble. Each warning sign they encountered presented the same impossible question: real or dummy? The tragic truth is that many guessed wrong. This legacy shaped international humanitarian law in subsequent decades. The protocols on mines and booby traps established in the 1970s and 80s attempted to address these issues. The use of dummy minefields, while not explicitly prohibited, became increasingly controversial. Modern military forces still use deception, but the emphasis has shifted toward techniques that don't leave behind lethal uncertainties for civilian populations. The evolution of tactical deception. As warfare evolved through the latter half of the 20th century, the principles behind the dummy minefield adapted to new technologies and doctrines. The Vietnam War saw both sides employ psychological deterrence extensively, though often with tragic consequences. The Viet Cong became infamous for their use of traps and mines, both real and implied. Warning signs written in broken English or French marked jungle trails, danger, mines ahead, or Americans go home or die. What made these signs particularly effective was the enemy's reputation. American and South Vietnamese forces knew that the Viet Cong did use extensive mining and booby trapping. The warnings might be genuine, or they might be placed to channel troops into ambush zones, or they might simply be psychological warfare designed to slow advances and increase stress. The uncertainty was the weapon. Israeli forces dealing with insurgent tactics in occupied territories faced similar challenges. Groups opposing the occupation would mark areas as mined or booby-trapped, forcing expensive and time-consuming security sweeps. Sometimes these warnings were genuine. Often they were not. But Israeli commanders couldn't afford to take chances, and so they had to treat each warning as potentially real. The principles evolved further with the rise of asymmetric warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. Insurgent groups would place signs warning of improvised explosive devices, sometimes in English, sometimes in pictogram form. Coalition forces, having experienced the devastating effects of real roadside devices, had to take these warnings seriously. Entire convoys might reroute or halt while explosive ordnance disposal teams investigated. Interestingly, these same conflicts saw the emergence of what might be called reverse psychological deterrence. Coalition forces would mark areas they had actually cleared of explosives, with signs stating the area was safe, but insurgents would sometimes alter or remove these signs, reintroducing uncertainty and forcing forces to re-clear areas multiple times. The core principle remained unchanged from World War II. Create uncertainty in the enemy's mind about where danger lies, and you can influence their behavior with minimal resources. From battlefield to backyard now. Here's where our story takes a fascinating turn, because the psychological principles that made dummy minefields so effective in warfare found a new application in civilian life. The transition wasn't immediate or obvious, but it followed a clear, logical path. In the decades following World War II, crime, particularly property crime, became an increasing concern in developed nations. The post-war boom meant more people owned more valuable possessions. Suburbanization created neighborhoods with houses spread out, making community surveillance less effective than in traditional urban areas, and the social disruptions of the 1960s and 70s saw crime rates spike dramatically. Homeowners and businesses looked for ways to protect their property. Traditional methods, locks, and barriers had their limits. You could install the best locks available, but determined criminals with the right tools could eventually defeat them. Physical barriers like fences could be scaled or cut. Guard dogs required training and daily care. Security guards for residential properties were prohibitively expensive for most people. Enter the home security system. Companies like ADT, founded shortly after World War II, pioneered the concept of electronic monitoring for residential properties. These systems used networks of sensors to detect intrusions and alert either the homeowner or a central monitoring station. They were effective, but they were also expensive. In the 1970s and 80s, a comprehensive home security system could cost thousands of dollars to install and required monthly monitoring fees. But security companies quickly realized something interesting. The mere presence of a security system sign in a front yard seemed to deter potential burglars. Even homes without actual systems would sometimes display signs or window decals indicating they were protected. And crime statistics suggested this simple deception had a measurable effect. This shouldn't surprise anyone who understands the history we've been discussing. The home security sign operates on exactly the same psychological principles as the World War II minefield warning. It creates uncertainty in the mind of a potential intruder. Is there really a system monitoring this house? What's the risk if I try to break in anyway? Are there easier targets nearby that aren't marked as protected? Just as a German dummy minefield forced Allied commanders to treat every marked zone as potentially lethal, a security sign forces burglars to treat every marked house as potentially monitored. The criminal faces an information asymmetry. They don't know if the sign represents a real system or an elaborate bluff. And given that the cost of guessing wrong could be arrest and imprisonment, many choose to simply move on to a less uncertain target. The modern evidence. In the 21st century, researchers have attempted to quantify the effectiveness of security signage with the rigor of controlled studies. The results are illuminating and would be familiar to any World War II military planner. A comprehensive study conducted at the University of North Carolina surveyed over 400 convicted burglars about their decision-making process when selecting targets. The researchers wanted to understand what factors deterred criminals and which encouraged them to proceed. Security system signage ranked 9th out of 22 deterrent factors. At first glance, 9th place might seem unimpressive, but context matters enormously. The factors rated higher than security signs included things like visible cameras, alert neighbors, and the presence of someone at home, all of which require significantly more investment than a simple sign. More importantly, security signage ranked above factors like sturdy locks, fences, and outdoor lighting. breaking down the numbers reveals even more interesting details. Approximately 25% of surveyed burglars stated that security signage alone was enough to make them abandon a potential target and look elsewhere. 1/4 of criminals deterred by nothing more than paint on metal or plastic. That's a substantial success rate for what amounts to a psychological operation. Other studies have examined the specific psychological mechanisms at play. Research published in the Journal of Criminal Justice and Behavior set up controlled experiments with both genuine security signs from established companies and fake signs from fictitious security firms. The findings aligned with military deception theory. Both types of signs showed deterrent effects, but genuine signs from recognized companies were notably more effective. Why the difference? It comes back to information and uncertainty. A professional criminal, someone who regularly commits burglaries, develops expertise in assessing risk. They become familiar with local security companies and their capabilities. A sign from ADT, a company known for rapid response and professional monitoring, carries more weight than a sign from Bob's Security Service. The latter might be dismissed as an obvious fake, just as a poorly constructed dummy minefield might be spotted as a deception by experienced reconnaissance troops. Interestingly, the research also found regional variations in effectiveness. In neighborhoods where security systems were common, signage had less deterrent effect because criminals expected to encounter them and developed strategies to work around them. In areas where such systems were rare, a single sign stood out and carried more psychological weight. This parallels military experience where overused deception tactics become less effective as opponents learn to recognize patterns. The arms race continues. Just as military forces constantly adapted their deception tactics to counter enemy countermeasures, the civilian security industry has evolved in response to criminal adaptation. Modern criminals have become more sophisticated in their risk assessment. They know that fake security signs are readily available online for a few dollars. They understand that not every camera they see is connected to a recording system. They've learned to look for subtle signs that might indicate whether a security system is genuine or a bluff. This has led to a modern arms race in deterrence technology. Today's security signs often include company phone numbers and website addresses, lending them authenticity. Some incorporate QR codes that link to real security company information. The goal is to make the sign itself more convincing, harder to dismiss as an obvious fake. But just as the Germans mixed real and dummy mines to create maximum uncertainty, the most effective modern approach combines genuine security measures with visible deterrence. A house might have a few real cameras at key entry points, backed by signs indicating comprehensive coverage. The presence of any genuine security makes all the warnings credible. A criminal can't be sure which windows are monitored and which aren't, so they must assume all are. This uncertainty, this inability to determine truth from deception, remains the heart of effective deterrence. The technology has also expanded beyond simple signs. Modern security systems often include features specifically designed for psychological deterrence. LED lights that blink on camera housings, visible whether the camera is actively recording or not. Audible tones when sensors are triggered. Robotic voices warning that this property is protected when motion is detected. All of these elements work together to create an impression of comprehensive, sophisticated security. Some systems have even returned to something resembling World War II dummy minefields in spirit. Motion-activated spotlights will illuminate different sections of a property when triggered, creating the impression that someone is actively monitoring and responding to intrusion attempts. The lights themselves might be automatic, but to a potential burglar in the darkness, they suggest active human attention. The legal and ethical landscape. This modern application of World War II deception tactics exists in a complex legal and ethical space that's worth examining. Just as military use of dummy minefields raised questions about proportionality and post-conflict danger, the civilian use of fake security signs involves considerations beyond simple effectiveness. From a legal standpoint, displaying a fake security sign is generally not prohibited. Unlike military deception, which is governed by international humanitarian law, civilian deterrence falls under property rights and fraud statutes. You can generally place whatever signs you want on your own property as long as they don't falsely represent government authority or violate trademark protections. However, that last point is worth noting. Many major security companies actively enforce their trademarks. Displaying an ADT sign when you don't have an ADT system could theoretically open you to legal action for trademark infringement. In practice, these companies rarely pursue homeowners for this, recognizing that widespread use of their signs, even fake ones, actually enhances their brand's deterrent value. But the legal risk exists, particularly if the fake sign is used in combination with an actual crime or insurance fraud. Insurance presents another complication. Many homeowner insurance policies offer discounts for properties with monitored security systems. Falsely claiming to have such a system to obtain this discount would constitute fraud. More subtly, displaying fake security signs might create questions if a burglary does occur. Did the homeowner take reasonable precautions, or did they rely solely on deception? Insurance adjusters and lawyers might scrutinize such situations closely. There's also an ethical dimension that parallels the post-World War II concerns about dummy minefields. By saturating neighborhoods with fake security signs, do we dilute the deterrent effect for everyone? If criminals learn that most signs are bluffs, they might begin ignoring all of them, even those indicating genuine systems. This creates a tragedy of the commons scenario, where individual rational behavior using cheap fake signs leads to a collectively worse outcome, reduced deterrence for everyone. Some security experts argue that fake signs create a false sense of safety that can be dangerous. Homeowners who rely solely on signs might neglect other, more fundamental security measures like quality locks, lighting, and neighborhood watch participation. They might take risks they wouldn't otherwise take, believing their fake security signs provide protection they don't actually possess. Lessons from history. Stepping back from the specifics, what can we learn from this 80-year journey of tactical deception from European battlefields to suburban front yards? Several principles emerge that apply far beyond security and deterrence. First, perception often matters more than reality in influencing behavior. The German dummy minefield was effective not because it actually stopped anyone who tried to cross it, but because it prevented attempts in the first place. Similarly, a security sign's value lies not in whether there's really a system behind it, but in whether potential criminals believe there might be. This touches on a deep truth about human psychology. We make decisions based on our assessment of the world, not the world as it objectively exists. In situations of uncertainty, we tend toward caution, especially when the potential negative outcomes are severe. This risk-averse tendency can be exploited through deception, but it also reflects a rational approach to decision-making under imperfect information. Second, effective deception requires attention to detail and consistency. The German dummy minefields worked because they incorporated multiple layers of evidence, disturbed ground, metal fragments, tripwires, and official signage. A single fake sign stuck in the ground wouldn't have the same effect. Similarly, a security sign is more convincing when accompanied by other visible security measures, even if some of those measures are also partly theatrical. This principle applies across countless domains beyond security. Successful deception, whether in military operations, marketing, or daily social interaction, depends on creating a coherent, believable narrative supported by multiple, consistent details. The moment inconsistencies appear, the entire deception becomes suspect. Third, All deception eventually faces counters as targets become more sophisticated. The initial German dummy minefields were devastatingly effective because Allied forces had no framework for suspecting their existence. As the war progressed and patterns emerged, engineers developed better methods for distinguishing real from fake. They learned to recognize the subtle differences in ground disturbance, to spot the patterns of scrap metal placement, eventually even to decipher the difference in sign markings. In the modern context, professional criminals have similarly learned to spot fake security signs. They know which companies are legitimate. They recognize outdated logos. They look for signs of actual monitoring equipment. The most effective deterrence keeps evolving, staying one step ahead of criminal counter-tactics. The future of deterrence. Looking forward, where might these principles lead? Technology continues to evolve, and with it, the tools of both security and deception. Artificial intelligence is already being deployed in security systems in ways that blur the line between real and dummy measures. Smart cameras that can distinguish between a person and a wandering cat, that can track suspicious behavior patterns, that can alert homeowners or security services in real time. But these same AI systems can also be programmed to create the appearance of sophisticated monitoring where none exists. Imagine a future security system that uses AI to create the impression of active human monitoring, lights that turn on in patterns, mimicking someone moving through a house, speakers that occasionally emit sounds consistent with occupancy, curtains that open and close on varying schedules. All of this could be automated to create uncertainty about whether the property is occupied or monitored, without requiring actual human presence or monitoring services. This represents the dummy minefield concept taken to its technological conclusion. The goal isn't to actually prevent intrusion through physical means, but to create sufficient uncertainty and perceived risk that intrusion attempts never occur. The system's effectiveness lies in the attacker's mind, not in the physical defenses themselves. But just as dummy minefields raised ethical concerns about collateral danger, these technologies prompt questions we're only beginning to grapple with. At what point does security theater become problematic? If everyone relies on fake deterrence, do we create a society where genuine security becomes impossible because nothing is trusted? How do we balance the efficiency of deception with the need for authentic protection? The enduring wisdom. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history is the enduring power of psychological warfare, whether on the battlefield or in civilian life. The human mind, with all its computational power and sophisticated reasoning, remains vulnerable to uncertainty and fear. We can be paralyzed by the possibility of danger just as effectively as by danger itself. The German engineer who first proposed creating fake minefields understood something profound about human nature. He recognized that our imagination of threat can be as powerful as actual threat. That fear of the unknown is often more paralyzing than confrontation with the known, and that creating and managing uncertainty is often more effective than building impenetrable defenses. This wisdom has echoed through military theory for millennia. Sun Tzu wrote that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. The dummy minefield achieves exactly this. It stops an advance without firing a shot, inflicting casualties, or expending ammunition. It wins through making the opponent choose not to fight, the highest form of victory. In our modern civilian context, the security sign that prevents a burglary before it begins achieves the same result. It protects property without confrontation, without violence, without the trauma of actual intrusion. The thief who walks past a signed house and chooses a different target has been defeated without ever knowing it. Conclusion. We began this journey in a modern suburb, looking at a simple yellow sign, warning of security systems. We traced its lineage back through decades of criminal deterrence, through asymmetric conflicts and counterinsurgency campaigns, all the way to the battlefields of World War II, where desperate German defenders needed to multiply their limited forces. The dummy minefield represents a perfect case study in tactical innovation born from necessity. Lacking the resources for comprehensive real defenses, German military planners created a deception so effective it changed how all subsequent forces approach offensive operations. The principle they discovered, that properly managed uncertainty can be as effective as actual defenses, revolutionized military thinking. That same principle, consciously or unconsciously, has been adopted by the home security industry. The sign in your neighbor's yard serves the same function as those red and white mine warnings on World War II battlefields. It creates doubt. It introduces risk into the criminal's calculation. It suggests that proceeding might carry costs that outweigh potential benefits. And it works. Not perfectly, not in every case, but statistically, measurably, it works. About 1 in 4 potential burglars will be deterred by security signage alone. Many more will be deterred when signs are combined with other visible security measures. The cost-benefit ratio rivals some of the most effective security investments available. But like all powerful tools, this technique comes with responsibilities. The dummy minefield left a legacy of danger that lasted decades after the war ended. Civilians died because they couldn't determine which warnings were real and which were theater. In our modern context, over-reliance on fake security creates vulnerabilities, both individual and collective. The most effective approach, both historically and today, combines real security with strategic deception. Some genuine defensive measures, backed by signs and visible deterrence, that suggest more comprehensive protection than actually exists. This mirrors the mixed-field tactics of World War II, where real and dummy mines would be intermixed to create maximum uncertainty. As you go about your daily life, you'll see these signs everywhere, in front of homes and businesses, on fences and windows. Protected by security system, 24-hour video surveillance, armed response. Each one is a small psychological warfare operation, a civilian descendant of those World War II mine warnings. Some indicate real systems, some are pure bluff. Most exist somewhere in between, representing partial security that's been enhanced by strategic deception. And potential criminals, like those World War II soldiers approaching marked minefields, must make their decisions based on incomplete information and the possibility of consequences they'd rather avoid. The forgotten World War II security method isn't really forgotten at all. It's been transformed, adapted to new contexts and technologies. But at its core, the principle remains unchanged. Create uncertainty about where danger lies, and you can influence behavior more effectively than with walls or weapons. Make potential attackers question whether the risk is worth the reward, and many will simply move on to easier targets. It's a testament to human ingenuity that a tactic developed in the desperate circumstances of industrial warfare found peaceful application in protecting homes and businesses. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most effective security doesn't come from impenetrable defenses, but from the clever management of information and perception. The next time you see a security sign, remember those German engineers on the Eastern Front, carefully painting warnings for minefields that didn't exist. Remember the Allied soldiers who approached those warnings with fear and respect, never knowing if they faced real danger or elaborate theater. And remember that the same psychological principles that shaped battles involving millions now quietly protect homes across the world. The forgotten has become ubiquitous. The military has become civilian. But the fundamental human psychology, the fear of uncertain danger, and the rational choice to avoid it remains exactly the same.